The cold had not yet become morning when the wooden bell awakened a world that was never truly alive. The air carried the scent of damp earth and stone walls, and the wind that slipped through the cracks in the window felt like a ghost that was never invited but always knew when to come. In the dark corner of an old convent, a nun had been awake even before the first rooster sang. She sat still in her thick robe, hugging her knees like a child who did not yet understand why the world demanded silence from every breath she took. She had lived behind these walls for 20 years. No one knew her name when she entered. And 2 decades later, she remained a name unknown. Every morning began with silence, not because quiet was beautiful, but because speaking could mean sin. The outside world had long frozen beyond the monastery walls. Snow fell uninvited, and life moved without ever truly being felt. She swept the stone floor that was always cold, picked hard bread from a wooden table that was always empty, and read the same prayer that had been spoken 1,000 times. Sometimes she forgot who the prayer was meant for. God had become a distant name, and prayer became a mechanical routine. Yet she continued, because stopping could mean punishment. She once had a voice. That voice once laughed, sang, called for her mother, who disappeared in the middle of winter. But here, voice did not belong to people. Voice belonged to rulers, never seen, but always listening. The head sister never spoke gently. She only pointed, and all understood. If that hand pointed to a bucket, then water must be drawn. If it pointed to the floor, then knees must meet stone. There were no questions, only obedience. Every wound was not healed. It was only left to become part of the skin, like the cuts on her fingers from washing bloody linen, or the scratches from branches blocking the path to the well. Pain became an old companion. She no longer cried. Tears do not grow in places too often dry, but night was always long. And in the dark, when all were asleep, she remembered a childhood that lived only as a faded shadow. There was an apple tree. There were her mother's hands, rough but warm. There was a name once often called. Now there was no name, only a title. Sister Maria, a name given, not chosen. A name that never felt like hers, but she held on to it, because it was the only thing left of the self she once knew. And with every step in that stone corridor, she tried to remember that life still moved, even slowly, even if no one saw her. The days in the convent were not divided by time, but by the sound of the bell. Morning, noon, evening, and night were only echoes that came and went, marking the moments to stand, to sit, to sing, or to remain silent. Sister Maria had not counted days since that first winter that froze the well and made all doors stiffen. She only knew when her body began to ache and when the sky turned grayer than usual. Food arrived like a punishment wrapped in silence. A bowl of thin porridge and a piece of bread as hard as stone. She chewed not out of hunger, but because she must. And as the food passed down her throat, she felt as if she was swallowing memories of a world long gone. No taste remained except bitterness. Sometimes she sat for long hours in the chapel, staring at the cold statue of Mary, surrounded by tiny candles whose flickering light trembled like her soul. In the prayer she had memorized since youth, she always inserted one line, never spoken aloud: "Please, remember me." That sentence was written in no holy book, yet it had become her private prayer for years. A silent whisper offered either to God or to herself, who was slowly sinking behind the black veil. Once, she asked the head sister about what weighed in her heart, about why hunger and loneliness came more often than the peace that was promised. But the head sister only looked at her with stone-like eyes and said that questioning was a form of rebellion. Since that day, Sister Maria never asked again. She learned that in this place, even curiosity could be sin. Only silence, obedience, and slow disappearance were allowed. Sometimes she imagined herself not as a person, but as a stone in the wall, or a candle that melted without a sound. In that numbness, she began to forget the shape of her own face. Mirrors only existed in the guest rooms, and guests never came. Sister Maria no longer knew whether she was still young or if her hair had turned to ash. All she knew was that her body now felt heavier when rising in the morning, and her thoughts more often drifted to places beyond the reach of prayer. The world had become narrow, bounded by dark corridors and the repeating sound of footsteps. But within that narrowness, she tried to guard the remnants of who she once was. A faint smile when the wind carried the smell of fresh earth after rain. A glance toward the small window when sunlight slipped through the dust. These small things were the fragments of life that still remained. And though no one saw them, she kept them quietly. Because for Sister Maria, that was the truest form of faith. Each night, before the final bell rang, the nuns sat cross-legged in neat rows, facing an altar that never spoke. Oil lamps hung low from the stone ceiling, casting a soft glow on faces that never showed emotion. Sister Maria's face was no different. Calm, still, and silent, like the surface of a pond, untouched by wind. But inside her, small ripples still stirred. She still remembered the sound of rustling leaves, a child's laughter, and sunlight weaving through her dark hair. These memories would appear briefly, then vanish like morning dew. There was no space for the past in this convent. All who entered here were meant to be dead to the world. But Sister Maria was not dead. She was only buried in a life that slowly erased her colors. And though her body obeyed, her heart still held pieces of a past she could not let go. That night, she bowed her head as usual. Her lips moved in the long memorized prayer, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She imagined a dirt path winding through a field of wheat, and at its end a small house with an open window. There, perhaps, her mother still sat weaving while singing, though that voice was now only an echo in her memory. Sister Maria did not know if her mother was still alive. There were no letters, no news. The rules of the convent forbade communication with the outside world. But longing does not obey rules. It grows like wild roots, piercing even the hardest walls. And night is the time when that longing rings loudest. In the dark, the footsteps of the head sister sounded like a hammer striking stone. Each night she checked the rooms, ensuring none slept before prayers were complete. As the sound came closer, Sister Maria straightened her body, held her breath so it would not be heard. No weakness allowed. No doubt. Only calm faces and folded hands. But inside her chest, her heart beat like a war drum. She feared not punishment, but the truth that every passing second pulled her further from herself. She did not want to become stone. She wanted to remain human, even in silence. After the prayer ended, the nuns returned to their small rooms lined like graves. No sound, no greeting, only soft steps on cold stone. Sister Maria entered her room, closed the cracked wooden door, and sat on the edge of her straw bed. She looked at the small window that showed only a dark sky without stars. Then she lay down, pulled the rough blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes with one simple hope. That in dreams she could become someone free. Not a sister, not a shadow, but a person. Someone who could laugh, cry, run beneath the sun, and say her own name without shame. Morning arrived not with the sun, but with the bell's sound that pierced the silence like a knife through fabric. Sister Maria opened her eyes before its echo truly rang, for her body had learned to rise before being commanded. She rose in darkness, donned the cold habit that now smelled like the stone walls. There was no mirror to see her face, no colors to mark the difference between morning and night. Everything was gray. Even the air felt heavy, as if reluctant to move. She stepped quietly into the washroom, where water stored in earthen jars was always as cold as a frozen river. She washed her hands and face with calm motions, unhurried, without expectation. Then she bowed her head, whispered a prayer, and began a day that felt no different from yesterday, and would likely be the same as tomorrow. In the dining hall, the sisters sat in rows, silent. No sound of spoons, for there was nothing to chew. Thin porridge was scooped by hand, eaten slowly, as if hiding the hunger within. No one looked at each other. Eyes remained lowered, as they had been taught since the beginning. To gaze too long was a form of pride. Sister Maria sometimes wondered if God too averted his eyes from them, or perhaps he looked and no longer recognized the faces slowly losing shape. After eating, they walked to the chapel for morning mass. Their footsteps moved in rhythm, like a procession of shadows trained not to let the world notice their existence. At the altar, sunlight finally appeared, seeping through stained glass, spreading red and blue across the stone floor. But none of them dared look too long. Color was too luxurious for eyes accustomed to gray. Sister Maria sat on the last wooden bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. But her thoughts wandered. She imagined another morning in a far-off place. Perhaps a small village, with the smell of warm bread and the sound of a rooster crowing. She knew the image wasn't real, but she allowed herself to linger there. Just for a moment, during the Mass, singing rose. Flat, slow, and curling like mist. Sister Maria joined in, but her voice was only a faint echo of what she once had. They said, once, she could sing beautifully. But now, she didn't even know what her voice sounded like. Too many parts of herself had been erased. In those low, droning tones, she sometimes felt she wasn't praising, but burying. Burying longing, burying desire. Burying the human who once lived behind this habit. Afternoons in the convent were not times for rest, but hours where the body worked so the mind wouldn't ask too many questions. The sisters dispersed to their tasks. Some stitched habits, scrubbed floors with rough stone, or tended to the small garden where only bitter plants and wildflowers grew. Sister Maria was assigned to the kitchen that day, cutting hard bread long past fresh and cleaning the large pot where soup was made. The steam from the dried remnants at the pot's bottom made her eyes water, but she didn't complain. Here, even complaints were to be whispered only in one's heart. Her hands moved with a slow but steady rhythm. Every movement had been trained not to make a sound. Even breath was taught not to stand out. She felt like a shadow, not a person. Someone who existed only to ensure everything remained quiet, continued as it was, unnoticed. In the kitchen's corner, a small window faced the back courtyard. There stood an old tree whose leaves always seemed to fall, as though it no longer believed in spring. Sister Maria would sometimes steal glances at it, searching for one leaf to drift gently down. That was enough to make her feel alive, because every falling leaf was proof that time still moved, even though inside the convent, time felt frozen. She remembered her childhood, playing under a similar tree with her younger sister. They would catch falling leaves and press them between book pages to remember. But here, there were no books, no blank pages to hold memory. Even her sister's name now felt foreign, like the faint echo of another person's life. As the afternoon grew longer, weariness crept in slowly. But there was no place to lie down, no word for rest. Every second was devotion. Yet for Sister Maria, there was another kind of devotion not found in the rule books, preserving the small part of herself that hadn't died completely. She knew better than to hope too much. She knew tomorrow would arrive as a duplicate of today. But she believed in the small, unseen things. In the falling leaf, in the faint light that crept through the window cracks, in the heartbeat that hadn't yet surrendered. She knew she was already half lost. But as long as she could still see a piece of the sky, even just a fragment, that would be enough to remain human. Not completely, but enough to know she hadn't been entirely destroyed. Evening in the convent was the quietest time, when the sky began to dim and the bird songs vanished as if swallowed by prayer. No bell rang, only the soft movements of the sisters preparing themselves for vespers. Sister Maria walked slowly down the long hallway, its walls painted with flickering candlelight shadows. The air was growing damp, and the scent of night crept in from the cracks between the stones. She carried an old book into her private prayer room, not to read its entirety, but to feel its weight, as if the words it held might offer her a reason for being. There she sat on the cold floor, her back against the wall, and turned through the yellowing pages. The script was small and dense, but her eyes were used to it. She no longer read, only traced the words as if touching the footprints of those who had long passed. She knew many things in life were not meant to be understood, only endured. Like prayers repeated endlessly, with no certainty anyone was listening. Sister Maria felt as if she lived in a pocket of forgotten time, a hollow untouched even as the world outside spun forward. She had forgotten the sound of a marketplace, or the smell of food cooked for someone you loved. She even forgot what it felt like to laugh without guilt. But evenings like this brought a kind of silence that did not frighten her. A silence that felt like an embrace from someone she never knew. As she closed the book, she exhaled slowly. Outside, the sky was darkening. The candlelight dimmed, and she could hear the footsteps of other sisters heading to the chapel. She stood, straightened her habit, and followed. But in her steps, there was a small pause. She stopped beneath a tiny window where the last orange of the sun flickered through. She looked at it, not to ask, not to remember, but simply to be. In that instant, she knew she was still here, still breathing, still able to see the small beauty that remained beneath all the silence and suffering. And in the quietest corner of her heart, she whispered a sentence found in no scripture. A sentence only a soul long shadowed could understand. I am still here. Night in the convent did not belong to dreams, but to memories that refused to lie still. After evening prayers ended, the sisters walked silently to their rooms in a ritual-like hush. No conversation, no laughter, only slow steps across the cold stone floor. Sister Maria's room was small and nearly bare. A hard wooden bed, a tiny table with no drawers, a crucifix on the wall, and a window that barely opened. Yet in that emptiness, the voices of the past grew louder. As she sat by her bed and removed her veil, she could almost hear her mother calling from far away. Not a real voice, of course, but a soft echo from a place untouched by time. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the dark room, all she could hear was her breath and the slow settling of her heartbeat. There were no clocks, no ticking seconds to remind her that the world kept moving. She sat for a long time, without words, without movement. Then, slowly, she lay down, pulling the thin blanket over her chest. Her body was tired, but her eyes remained open. And in that moment, the memories crept in like rainwater, finding cracks in an old roof. She saw a younger version of herself, wearing a thin white dress, dancing among tall grass. She saw her sister laughing, holding their father's hand, a face long forgotten. She remembered the smell of their home, filled with wood and warm soup. But all of it now felt like a dream that never truly happened. What remained was the long silence that wrapped her entire body like fog. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. Tears did not grow on soil that had long gone dry. She wanted to pray, but words felt like burdens she could no longer lift. So she simply stayed still, blending into a darkness that neither threatened nor comforted. In that darkness, the only thing that felt real was the cold at her fingertips and the heart that still beat. A slow rhythm, barely audible, but still there. And she knew, even if no one saw, even if no one cared, her life still moved forward. Quiet, dark, fragile, but real. And within those stone walls, she prayed not for salvation, not for heaven, but for the strength to face tomorrow again. Tomorrow, which would be the same, but tomorrow, she knew, still had to be lived, because she was still here. Not all suffering leaves visible wounds. There is pain that does not bruise, does not bleed, but slowly eats away at whatever makes a person feel alive. The next morning, when the first bell rang, Sister Maria opened her eyes without surprise, as if the night had never really happened. She rose in a silence she had long known. Outside, the morning mist blanketed the convent courtyard, making everything look like an unfinished dream. She put on her habit again, tied her belt, and straightened the bed that was never truly disturbed. Routine became a way to avoid thinking. Every movement had its order, every task its time. No need to choose, no need to ask. But among all that order, there was one moment when her mind drifted. As she passed by the small library, she noticed a slip of paper fallen from an old book. The paper held faded handwriting, a simple poem about morning light and hope arriving slowly like fog. She picked it up, read it silently, and for a moment, something inside her trembled. Not joy, not sorrow, but a feeling that some small part of her could still respond to beauty. She tucked the paper into her robe's pocket, not because she expected anything to change, but because she wanted to keep it. A small gesture that not everything in the world had to be forgotten. That day passed as usual. Handwork, long prayers, silent meals. But within her, Sister Maria carried a fragment of poetry that whispered what she could never say aloud. She began to notice the sound of wind through window cracks. She saw the reflection of light on the stone floor. She watched her own footsteps and realized she was still here. The world remained harsh, remained quiet. But there was a small space within her that hadn't died. A space where soft words could whisper, where memories could settle without pain, where she could feel that being human was not a sin. At the end of the day, before sleep, she read the poem again, not to understand, but to feel. And as she closed her eyes, she knew she would wake tomorrow, not because she had to, but because she could. And that, for that night, was enough. Among all things lost, the quietest is a name never spoken again. Sister Maria had long forgotten what her own voice sounded like when she used to say her name freely. In the convent, she was known only as part of a line, not as a person. Her name was never spoken with tenderness, only written on duty lists or called during chores. But once, long ago, there was a time when her name was spoken with love, a time when someone said it just to make her smile. Now, her name felt like a stone buried at the bottom of a river, not lost, but no longer seen. One night, as a storm came and the wind slammed against the windows, Sister Maria woke earlier than usual. She wasn't afraid. In fact, the storm made her feel alive, because finally, something was louder than silence. She rose from her bed, walked slowly to the small window, and drew back the thin, cold curtain. Outside, the sky was pitch dark, but flashes of lightning lit the courtyard in harsh white. And in the wind and thunder, she felt something she had lost long ago. Courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to remember. She opened the small drawer in her rarely touched desk. Inside was only one thing, a piece of thin cloth embroidered with her childhood name, a gift from her mother. She had never shown this name to anyone in the convent. It belonged to a world she had left behind. But that night, amid the whispering rain and booming thunder, she touched the cloth with trembling fingertips. She spelled her name in her heart, slowly, as if reviving a piece of herself long buried. And suddenly, her tiny room didn't feel quite so small. She didn't cry, but her breath caught in her throat. Something lifted from her chest, an unnamed weight. That name wasn't just hers, it was her story. A story not written in scriptures, not carved in stone, but real. She knew she would remain a shadow among thousands of other sisters. But that night, she became someone again. Someone with a name, with a story, with a past. And in that storm, she felt more real than in the last 10 years. Time in the convent was not a straight line, but a circle that always returned to the same place day after day. The seasons passed, yet the sound of the bells remained the same. The duties unchanged, and the quiet that clung to the old walls never truly left. But after that stormy night, something shifted in the way Sister Maria walked, even if no one noticed. Her steps were still slow, but now more steady. Her gaze remained gentle, but held something deeper. She remained quiet, obedient, performing her tasks as always. But behind that expressionless face, a small universe began to grow again. She greeted the wildflowers blooming between wall cracks softly in her heart. She listened to the morning birds as if they were music meant only for her. And every night before bed, she would take out that small cloth and touch it once. A silent reminder that she had once been loved and was still worthy of remembering. No one knew that within her, she began writing poems. Not with pen and ink, but with thoughts and feelings she was slowly gathering once more. Every small event, every sound, every ray of light through the window became verses forming a new world within her. She never recited them, never wrote them down, but those poems lived in her eyes, her breath, her way of seeing the world. The convent did not change, and the days remained long, filled with prayers and work. But when she stood before the altar or swept the courtyard, Sister Maria knew she was no longer just a figure in a dark habit. She was someone who had faced darkness and still chose to keep a light, however small, however private. And that was a strength no one could see, but enough to carry her. Because sometimes enduring is the purest form of prayer. And in her silence, Sister Maria had prayed more deeply than anyone could ever count. She knew that one day she might be forgotten, like many sisters before and after her. But for now, she was still here. And as long as she was here, she would continue to live in the only way she knew how. With silence, with gentleness, with devotion. And for her, that was enough. In the end, not every story needs a spotlight. Not every life must be recorded in grand history books or carved in stone to be meaningful. Behind the gray walls of a forgotten convent, there are souls like Sister Maria's who lived and endured without ever being mentioned, without ever being praised, without ever being officially remembered. Yet it is in that silence that they shaped the world. With wordless prayers, with unseen labor, with patience that was never documented. Sister Maria was no hero. She did not change the world, but she was the world to herself, and to the wildflowers blooming quietly in the courtyard, to the stray kitten that sometimes appeared in the kitchen, to a piece of poetry tucked inside an old book. She was witness to an existence that never shouted, but never gave up. The modern world often forgets to value that kind of strength. We admire the brilliant, the bold, the victorious. But the world is also held together by those who choose silence, who remain present, who endure without sound. Those who never leave their place even when no one sees them. In a world full of noise, a life like Sister Maria's might seem small, even meaningless. But if we pause for a moment, close our eyes, and listen to the breath of time, we'll know that the greatest courage sometimes comes from those who are the quietest. In prayers whispered with closed eyes, in resolve that seeks no recognition, in love that asks for nothing in return. Sister Maria will continue her days with slow steps and gentle hands, with a heart that still holds poetry. She will not be remembered in grand history, but in the small history, the one known only to stone walls, morning wind, and the dim light of an old chapel. Her name will always live on. And perhaps in your sleep tonight, you'll feel it, as if someone from far away, from a time long past, is softly whispering, not to be heard, but to be felt. And in that moment, Sister Maria's story becomes truly eternal.